In 2004, analysts at the FBI sat down with decades of unsolved murder files and saw something that had been there the entire time. Not a new pattern, an old one. Over 750 victims. Hundreds of crime scenes spread across nearly every state in the country. And one thing in common, all of them were found near highways, far from where they were last seen, in jurisdictions that had no reason to connect them. The FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative that year, and what they found wasn't just a series of murders. It was a structural failure that had been active since the 1970s. 25 long-haul truckers are now in prison for multiple homicides. 450 suspects are in the database, and around 200 cases remain unsolved. This video covers 10 things the FBI documented in that initiative: patterns, gaps, and unanswered questions that appear in federal records, VICAP reports, and court filings that were never fully explained. What the Highway Serial Killings Initiative found in 2004 was not a series of new murders. It was decades of old ones that had never been connected. According to the FBI's own published materials, the cases in the database stretch back to the 1970s. That means approximately 30 years of unsolved homicides were investigated, filed, and left cold in separate local jurisdictions before anyone realized they were part of the same pattern. The FBI has never formally explained why it took 3 decades to see what was already in the record. The scale, once recognized, was significant. Over 750 victims are now documented in the Highway Serial Killings database. More than 450 suspects have been identified. 25 of those suspects have been convicted. Approximately 200 cases remain unsolved. These are not estimates. These are figures the FBI has confirmed publicly. The same agency that identified the pattern is the agency stating that hundreds of those cases will likely never close. What makes highway serial killings distinct from other forms of serial predation is not psychology. It is geography. The abduction site, the murder, and the disposal of the body can be separated by hundreds of miles and multiple state lines. A detective in Tennessee in 1987 investigating a body with no local connection, no witnesses, and no missing person report would have nothing to work with. That scene repeated across 15 states, handled by 15 different agencies, none of whom had reason to communicate. Each case appeared isolated. Each was investigated as such. The pattern only became visible when someone looked at all of them at once. The victims shared certain characteristics that made pattern recognition even more difficult. Many were transient. Many were involved in sex work. Many were hitchhikers. These were individuals whose lives placed them outside the infrastructure that typically triggers missing person investigations. They moved frequently. They were estranged from family. They operated in economies and social networks that don't generate police reports. When they disappeared, no one filed paperwork. When their bodies were found, no one came looking. The interstates themselves contributed to the problem. The U.S. highway system was built for speed and distance. Long-haul truckers cover thousands of miles a week, crossing state and county lines constantly. A driver can pick someone up in Georgia, cross into Tennessee, dispose of a body in a rural area off Highway 75, and be in Kentucky by morning. The jurisdictions involved, if they're involved at all, have no overlapping information. Georgia may not know the person is missing. Tennessee may not know a crime occurred within its borders. The county where the body is found has remains, but no identity, no context, and no investigative lead. This is not a failure of diligence. It is a feature of how the system was designed. Local law enforcement investigates local crimes. When a crime is committed in motion across boundaries that define jurisdictional authority, the system loses coherence. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative was created explicitly to address that gap. It did not fix the gap, it documented it. What is notable is not that the FBI eventually recognized the pattern. What is notable is how long the pattern existed before recognition occurred. If the earliest cases in the database date to the 1970s and the initiative launched in 2004, that is 30 years during which these murders were being committed, investigated locally, and filed as unsolved without anyone connecting them. 30 years during which the data existed, the bodies were cataloged, and the jurisdictional gaps were functioning exactly as designed. The question the FBI has not answered is whether that delay was inevitable, or whether it could have been shortened if someone had been looking at the national picture sooner. By the time the pattern was identified, it had been active for a generation. Hundreds of women were dead. Dozens of suspects had been operating with impunity. And the structural conditions that allowed it to continue, the jurisdictional boundaries, the lack of centralized communication, the absence of a system designed to track crimes that move, were still in place. The FBI documented two structural problems at the center of highway serial killing cases, both of which remain unresolved. The first is jurisdictional, the second is bureaucratic. Together they explain why so many of these cases were never solved and why so many remain open. The jurisdictional gap is not a matter of investigative failure. It is a design problem. A victim is picked up in Georgia. She is murdered in Tennessee. Her body is dumped in a rural area just over the Florida state line. Georgia may have a missing person report, but no body and no evidence of foul play. Tennessee has no report at all because the victim was never reported missing there, and the crime occurred in a vehicle that passed through without stopping. Florida has a body with no identification, no local connection, and no reason to believe the crime originated anywhere other than where the remains were found. None of the three jurisdictions have enough information to investigate the case meaningfully. None of them are communicating because none of them know the others are involved. This is the scenario the FBI described in its published analysis of the initiative. It is the reason the unit was created, and it is a gap that has not been structurally fixed. VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, and the Highway Serial Killings Initiative are tools for voluntary coordination. They rely on agencies choosing to input data, choosing to search the database, and choosing to communicate across jurisdictions. They do not override the fundamental structure of American law enforcement, which is local and territorially defined, and operates within boundaries that make crimes committed, in motion, nearly invisible. What this means in practice is that a suspect can operate across multiple states, leaving crime scenes in jurisdictions that never develop enough evidence to make an arrest. Each local agency sees only its own piece of the pattern. Without a mechanism to connect those pieces, the suspect remains free. The FBI has stated this plainly. Even when the pattern evidence is strong, without a victim tied to a specific jurisdiction, there is often no legal mechanism to make an arrest. The second structural problem is the invisible victim. According to FBI documentation, many of the women in the highway serial killings database were never reported missing. They were transient, estranged from family, or involved in survival sex work. No missing person report was filed. No investigation was triggered. They exist in the federal record only as unidentified remains found along a highway. The FBI noted this explicitly in public materials. Some of these victims have no documentation of their existence outside the moment their body was discovered. What no report means is more than administrative absence. It means no investigative trigger. Without a missing persons report, there is no active case. Without family searching, there is no media attention. Without media attention, there is no public pressure. Without pressure, The case sits in a file room, unidentified and unresolved. These women were alive. They had names, histories, routines. The bureaucratic record of their existence begins only at the point of death, on the side of a road, far from wherever they were last seen. The FBI did not just find bodies. It found gaps in the social infrastructure, people who disappeared and were not missed, not because they were not loved, but because the circumstances of their lives placed them outside the systems designed to notice absence. Transience, estrangement, and informal economies operate beyond the reach of missing persons databases. When someone in that position vanishes, there is no paperwork. When their remains are found, there is no one looking for them. The system was not built to account for that kind of disappearance. The jurisdictional gap and the invisible victim problem are not separate issues. They compound each other. A victim who is never reported missing cannot generate a missing persons case in the jurisdiction where she was last seen. A body discovered in a different state cannot be connected to that non-existent report. The crime, in bureaucratic terms, has no origin point and no ownership. It exists in the gap between systems that were never designed to interface. The FBI's identification of these problems in 2004 was not revelatory to the investigators who had been working these cases locally for years. County detectives in rural Tennessee and Florida had been finding unidentified bodies along interstates since the 1980s. They knew the victims had no local ties. They knew the crimes were likely committed elsewhere. What they did not have was a way to connect their cases to others, or a database that would allow them to see the pattern. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative created that database. It did not create a solution to the jurisdictional and social gaps that allowed the murders to occur in the first place. Those gaps remain. Robert Ben Rhodes was arrested on April 1, 1990, on the shoulder of Interstate 40 in Arizona. A state trooper conducted a routine traffic stop. What he found in the sleeper cab of Rhodes's truck was a woman, restrained, in a compartment that had been modified with torture equipment. Rhodes was a long-haul trucker. He had been driving interstate routes for years. He was convicted of 2 murders. Investigators believe he is responsible for up to 50. What makes the Rhodes case notable is not the conviction. It is what the FBI documented afterward. Rhodes had been stopped by law enforcement on multiple prior occasions. He had been released. No single jurisdiction had enough evidence to hold him. The modifications to his truck, the restraints, the equipment, were visible to anyone who looked inside the sleeper cab. But no one had looked with enough cause to act. Arizona didn't catch Rhodes through investigation. They caught him because a trooper happened to pull him over at the right moment and happened to check the cab. The implication is direct. Rhodes had been operating across state lines for years, and the infrastructure of American law enforcement in the 1980s had no mechanism to connect what he was doing in Tennessee to what he was doing in Texas to what he was doing in Illinois. He wasn't invisible, he was mobile, and in the system as it was designed, mobility functioned as invisibility. The FBI used Rhodes's logbooks to reverse engineer his routes. Trucking companies require drivers to document their trips, fuel stops, way stations, delivery times, mileage. Rhodes kept logs. Investigators cross-referenced those logs with unsolved cases in the jurisdictions he had passed through. That is how they arrived at 50 suspected victims. They could see where he had been and when he had been there. They could see which cases matched his timeline. What they could not do, what they still cannot do, is connect him definitively to most of those cases. Because the evidence required to prove a murder in one county does not transfer automatically to another county 3 states away. One of the cases the FBI was able to connect involved a 14-year-old girl named Regina Walters. Walters disappeared while hitchhiking in Texas in 1990. Her body was found in a barn in Illinois. Rhodes had photographed her before killing her. The photograph was recovered in his possession after his arrest. Investigators used the image, combined with Rhodes's travel logs, to establish the timeline: abduction in Texas, murder and disposal in Illinois, weeks later. The photograph was evidence. It was also a timestamp. What was never explained is how many other people saw Regina Walters during the period she was with Rhodes. She was traveling in his truck, across state lines, over the course of days or weeks. Truck stops, blood rest areas, way stations, gas stations. Rhodes moved through public spaces with a kidnapped girl in his vehicle, and no one intervened. The FBI has not addressed how many similar cases exist in the database. Cases where victims were held for extended periods while the truck continued its route through multiple states. The question is not whether other drivers or workers saw something. The question is whether they understood what they were seeing. Bruce Delane Mendenhall was arrested in 2007 at a truck stop in Tennessee. A truck stop employee reported seeing blood and other signs of violence in the cab of Mendenhall's truck. When law enforcement searched the vehicle, they found physical evidence consistent with multiple crimes. Mendenhall was a long-haul trucker who operated primarily across the southeastern United States. He was convicted of one murder. Investigators believe he is responsible for up to 50 deaths. The gap between one conviction and 50 suspected victims is the structural gap the FBI has documented throughout the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. It is not that investigators lack confidence in the connection between Mendenhall and those cases. It is that the evidence required to support a conviction must meet jurisdiction-specific standards, and the cases are spread across more than a dozen states. Each jurisdiction investigated the murders that occurred within its boundaries. Few had the resources or the legal authority to pursue connections across state lines. Mendenhall's trucking routes were documented. His presence in the areas where victims disappeared was documented. What could not be documented, in most cases, was the direct physical evidence, linking him to a specific victim in a way that would satisfy the legal threshold for prosecution in that victim's jurisdiction. What is notable about both Rhodes and Mendenhall is that they were not caught through coordinated investigation. They were caught because someone saw something and acted on it in the moment. An Arizona state trooper who checked a sleeper cab during a traffic stop, a truck stop employee who reported blood in a vehicle. These were not the result of pattern recognition or interstate coordination. They were accidents. The FBI's documentation reflects this clearly. Both men had been active for years. Both had been stopped by law enforcement before. Both had passed through jurisdictions where unsolved murders were later connected to their roots. The system did not identify them. The system stumbled into them. The question the FBI has not answered is how many others are still operating under the same conditions that allowed Rhodes and Mendenhall to continue for as long as they did. The jurisdictional structure has not fundamentally changed. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative created a database and a coordination mechanism, but it did not alter the legal authority of local agencies or the evidentiary requirements for prosecution. What the FBI documented in the cases of Rhodes and Mendenhall is that the system depends on chance, on the right person being in the right place at the right time and choosing to act. That is not an investigative strategy. That is luck. The FBI's VICAP database currently lists 450 individuals as suspects in the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. 25 have been convicted. 425 are still driving. The FBI has confirmed this publicly. The agency has also confirmed that without a victim connected to a specific jurisdiction, there is often no mechanism to arrest a suspect even when the pattern evidence is strong. What pattern evidence means in this context is not speculative. It refers to documented correlations that appear across multiple unsolved cases. Similar disposal methods, used in different states, timelines that match a driver's logged routes, repeated presence in areas where victims were last seen. These are not suspicions. They are data points extracted from VICAP entries, trucking company records, and cross-referenced case files. What the FBI has stated clearly is that this type of evidence is not sufficient for prosecution in most jurisdictions. A pattern across 5 states does not give any single state the authority to act. The law requires a direct evidentiary link between a suspect and a victim within a defined legal boundary. Presence in an area is not enough. Matching timelines are not enough. Without physical evidence tying a suspect to a specific crime in a specific place, the legal threshold is not met. This is not an investigative failure. This is the structure of the law as it exists. The 450 suspects in the database are known to the FBI. They are not hidden. They are not unidentified. They are driving trucks on Americans' highways, and the system has no mechanism to stop them unless they make a mistake that can be prosecuted within the jurisdictional framework that has been in place since before the initiative was created. On January 8, 2025, Dimitri Williams disappeared from a rest area on Interstate 10 in Mississippi. Williams was a long-haul trucker employed by a commercial carrier. Surveillance footage from the rest area captured a black SUV approaching Williams's parked truck. Williams exited his vehicle and entered the SUV. The vehicle left the rest area. Williams has not been seen since. The SUV has not been publicly identified. What makes the Williams case consistent with the FBI's documented pattern is not the disappearance itself. It is the context. Williams's employer noted that his check-in pattern was so consistent that the absence of communication was immediately recognized as abnormal. Long-haul truckers operate on schedules that are tracked electronically and procedurally. GPS, logbook entries, delivery confirmations, fuel purchases. Williams checked in at predictable intervals. When he stopped checking in, his employer knew within hours. That level of behavioral consistency makes the break in pattern more significant, and it matches the profile the FBI has noted in other cases. Experienced drivers, consistent schedules, sudden, unexplained silence. The surveillance footage shows Williams entering the SUV voluntarily. That is what the available record indicates. It does not show what happened after the vehicle left the rest area. It does not show who was driving the SUV. It does not show whether Williams knew the person he was meeting. The FBI has not publicly identified the vehicle or stated whether it has been located. What is documented is that the case fits within the parameters of the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. A driver, a rest area, an unexplained disappearance, and no clear jurisdictional lead. Alejandro Jacomino Gonzalez disappeared from a rest area on Interstate 95 in South Carolina on January 13, 2025. Gonzalez was hauling high-value vehicles, luxury cars being transported from Florida to the Northeast. Several of the vehicles he was hauling went missing when he did. His body was found weeks later on the Georgia coast. The Gonzalez case introduces a complication that the FBI has documented separately, but has not resolved. The intersection of highway serial predation and organized cargo theft. Interstate 95 is one of the most heavily trafficked freight corridors in the United States. It is also one of the corridors where cargo theft networks are most active. The FBI has tracked both patterns independently: driver disappearances that fit the serial killing profile, and coordinated cargo thefts that involve vehicles, electronics, and pharmaceuticals being stolen from trucks along predictable routes. What the FBI noted in the Gonzalez case is that both patterns may apply. His body was found, which suggests violence consistent with the predatory pattern documented in the initiative. But the missing vehicles suggest a cargo theft motive, which operates under different logic and involves different networks. The FBI's investigation documented this as an unresolved intersection. It is not clear whether Gonzalez was targeted because of what he was hauling, or whether the theft was secondary to another motive. It is not clear whether one network was involved or two. The agency has not stated publicly which investigative thread it is prioritizing. What is clear is that Gonzalez was an experienced driver operating in a high-risk corridor, and the circumstances of his disappearance and death match elements of both documented patterns. That overlap has not been explained. The FBI has confirmed that cargo theft networks are active along I-95. The FBI has confirmed that the Highway Serial Killings Initiative is tracking unsolved driver disappearances along I-95. Whether those two realities intersect in cases like Gonzalez's is not something the available record resolves. The 450 suspects still in the database represent the unresolved present tense of the initiative. The FBI knows who they are. In some cases, the agency knows where they drive, what routes they operate, and which unsolved cases align with their documented presence. What the FBI cannot do is act on that knowledge unless a prosecutable link is established within a single jurisdiction. That is the gap that has existed since the 1970s. That is the gap that still exists now. The cases of Dimitri Williams and Alejandro Jacomino Gonzalez are not cold cases. They are active investigations occurring in 2025 under the same structural conditions that allowed Robert Ben Rhodes and Bruce Mendenhall to operate for years before they were stopped by chance. The database is larger now. The coordination is better. The awareness exists. But the system that depends on jurisdictional boundaries and direct evidence has not fundamentally changed. The 425 suspects still driving are the documented proof of that. When Alejandro Jacomino Gonzalez disappeared from a Narter E95 rest area in 2025, he was hauling luxury vehicles. Several of those cars went missing with him. His body was found weeks later on the Georgia coast. The FBI's investigation noted this as an intersection of two documented patterns: highway driver targeting and cargo theft networks that operate along the I-95 corridor. The cargo theft angle was documented as a separate investigative thread. Neither has been conclusively resolved. What makes this case difficult to classify is not that it lacks evidence, it's that it fits two patterns simultaneously. Was Gonzalez killed because of what he was hauling, or because he was a driver in the wrong place at the wrong time? The FBI has been tracking both possibilities. They have not said the patterns are connected. They have also not said they are distinct. The I-95 corridor has been documented by both the FBI and the Department of Transportation as a high-activity zone for organized cargo theft. The infrastructure is well established. Theft rings target high-value loads, often using surveillance at rest stops and weigh stations to identify vehicles, then either hijacking the truck or waiting for the driver to be vulnerable. The DOT has published advisories on this for years. Trucking companies train drivers to recognize the signs. Law enforcement agencies in states along I-95 coordinate on cargo theft cases because the operations cross jurisdictions in exactly the same way serial predation does. What the FBI documented in the Gonzalez case is that both criminal infrastructures were active in the same location at the same time. The rest area where he was last seen is documented in the Highway Serial Killings database as a site where other drivers have reported suspicious activity. It is also documented in cargo theft reports as a known surveillance point for theft operations. The FBI's investigative file reflected both possibilities. The case has not been classified as one or the other. This is not the only case where the overlap appears. In at least 3 other documented disappearances of drivers hauling high-value cargo along I-95, the FBI's records show the same investigative split. Evidence consistent with targeted theft, and evidence consistent with predatory targeting of the driver as an individual. In 2 of those cases, the cargo was never recovered. In one case, the cargo was located abandoned, but the driver was not. The pattern suggests that in some instances, both motives may be operating, or that what begins as one kind of crime becomes another. What investigators have struggled with is determining which pattern explains the primary motive. If a driver is killed and the cargo is taken, was the killing incidental to the theft, or was the cargo incidental to the killing? The question is not academic. It determines which investigative database the case enters, which task force handles it, and what kind of suspect profile gets built. A cargo theft ring operates differently than a serial predator. The victim selection is different. The geographic range is different. The evidence left behind is different. But when both sets of evidence are present, the case does not fit cleanly into either category. The FBI has not publicly stated that highway serial killers are involved in organized cargo theft. They have also not ruled it out. What they have documented is that some suspects in the highway serial killings database have criminal histories that include theft, fraud, and trafficking, not just violence. The investigative question is whether those are separate criminal behaviors that happen to coexist in the same individual, or whether some operations involve multiple actors with different motives converging on the same victim. What is also documented is that cargo theft networks rely on the same jurisdictional gaps that serial predators exploit. A theft that begins in Virginia, continues into North Carolina, and ends with an abandoned truck in South Carolina involves 3 separate state agencies, none of which may have full visibility into the sequence. The truck is recovered in South Carolina, but the theft occurred in Virginia, and the driver was last confirmed in North Carolina. Which agency owns the case? The same structural problem that allows serial predation to go undetected for decades also allows cargo theft rings to operate across state lines with limited coordination. The I-95 corridor is not unique in this regard, but it is the most heavily documented. The volume of commercial traffic, the density of rest stops, and the value of cargo moving along that route make it a high probability zone for both patterns. The FBI's documentation reflects this. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative tracks incidents along Sans 95. So does the FBI's cargo theft program. The 2 databases are maintained separately. There is no formal system for cross-referencing them. What cannot be determined from the available record is whether cases like Gonzalez's represent an overlap of 2 unrelated criminal patterns, or whether some operations involve coordination between predators and theft networks. The FBI has not addressed this question in published materials. What they have addressed is that both patterns are active, both are being tracked, and in some cases, like Gonzalez's, the evidence does not clearly resolve into one or the other. The cargo theft question adds a layer of complexity to the already difficult problem of identifying and prosecuting highway predators. It introduces the possibility that some victims are targeted for multiple reasons, that some crime scenes contain evidence from more than one kind of operation, and that some suspects may be involved in networks rather than acting alone. The FBI has documented all of these possibilities. They have not documented conclusions. The FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative with support from the trucking industry. That language appears in the agency's own published materials. The support included distribution of awareness campaigns, asking drivers to report suspicious activity at rest stops and truck stops, altercations, women in distress, vehicles behaving unusually, anything that felt wrong. The campaigns were designed to turn the driver network into an informal surveillance system. Thousands of drivers on the road at any given time, moving through the same locations where predators operate, potentially witnessing things that law enforcement would never see. What the FBI also documented in the same reports is that drivers regularly witness exactly those things and don't report them. Not because they don't care, because they don't know who to call, because they can't afford the delay, or because they don't believe it will matter. The gap between what drivers see and what gets reported is one of the unresolved problems in the FBI's own analysis. The awareness exists. The reporting infrastructure does not. The reasons are structural, not personal. Truck drivers operate on tight schedules with narrow margins. Time is money in a direct, measurable way. A driver who stops to call in a disturbance at a rest stop and then gets held for questioning by local police can lose hours, miss a delivery window, and face financial penalties from the company. If the disturbance turns out to be nothing, or if the local agency doesn't take it seriously, the driver has absorbed that cost for no outcome. The calculation is not about apathy, it's about risk. There is also the question of who to call. A driver passing through a state where they don't live, calling a local police department about something they saw at a rest stop an hour ago, may not be taken seriously. The driver has no jurisdiction, no standing, and often no follow-up information. They saw something, they're reporting it, and then they're gone. Local law enforcement may not have the context to know what the report means, especially if the incident is part of a pattern that crosses state lines. The report gets filed. It may not get connected to anything else. The driver doesn't know if anything happened as a result. Over time, the belief that reporting doesn't matter becomes self-reinforcing. The FBI documented this explicitly. Drivers told investigators that they had seen women in distress at truck stops, arguments that seemed wrong, vehicles following trucks in ways that felt deliberate, and had not called it in because they didn't know what agency would handle it, didn't want to be delayed, or assumed someone else would report it. Some drivers said they had called in suspicious activity in the past and never heard anything back, which made them less likely to call again. The system does not provide feedback. The driver reports something, and then there is silence. There is no way to know if the report mattered. What makes this particularly difficult is that drivers are often the only witnesses to the early stages of these crimes. A woman getting into a truck at a rest stop, a vehicle circling the parking lot multiple times, a driver being approached by someone on foot in a way that doesn't fit normal interaction patterns. These are the moments before something happens, and truck drivers see them more often than anyone else because they are in those locations constantly. But the witnessing happens in isolated intervals. The driver sees something at a rest stop in Tennessee, reports it or doesn't, and then is 3 states away by the next day. There is no continuity, no follow-up, and no mechanism for that driver to know whether what they saw was part of a larger pattern. The FBI's awareness campaigns were designed to address this, but the campaigns rely on voluntary reporting in a system that has not been restructured to make reporting practical. A driver has to choose to stop, choose to call, choose to wait, and choose to absorb the consequences of that decision, with no guarantee that it will matter. The FBI has acknowledged this in published materials. They have not solved it. What is also worth noting is that the same problem exists among truck stop employees. Workers at rest stops and truck stops see the same things drivers see, often with more continuity because they are in the same location every day. They see repeat visitors. They see patterns in who shows up and when. They notice vehicles that park for too long or drivers who behave in ways that don't fit the usual flow of traffic. Some of those workers have reported suspicious activity. Some have not. For many of the same reasons drivers don't report. The awareness exists. The infrastructure to act on it does not. The FBI documented one case in which a truck stop worker in Tennessee called police after noticing a driver returning to the lot repeatedly over the course of several weeks, each time parking in a different location and walking the lot on foot. The worker didn't know what the driver was doing, but the pattern felt wrong. Local police took a report but did not investigate further because no crime had been committed. 3 months later, a body was found near that truck stop. The suspect was never identified. The FBI's file on the case noted the earlier report from the truck stop worker, but by that point, the pattern had already moved. This is not a failure of individuals. It is a structural problem. The people who are in the best position to see early warning signs are also the people with the least ability to act on them. They do not have access to the databases. They do not know if what they are seeing is part of a pattern. They do not have a direct line to the investigators who would know. They see something, they report it or they don't, and then the system either absorbs the information or it doesn't. There is no mechanism to close that loop. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative was built, in part, to address this by creating a centralized database where patterns could be identified across jurisdictions. But the database only works if incidents are reported and entered in the first place. If a driver sees something and doesn't call it in, the information never reaches the database. If a local agency takes a report but doesn't classify it in a way that flags it for VICAP, the information exists but isn't connected. The system depends on every link in the chain functioning correctly, and the FBI's own documentation shows that many of those links are not functioning. What has not been resolved is how to make reporting practical for the people who are most likely to witness these crimes in progress. The FBI has distributed hotline numbers. They have worked with trucking companies to include reporting information in driver training. They have published guidelines for what kinds of activity should be reported. But none of that changes the fact that a driver on a schedule, in an unfamiliar state, with no guarantee of follow-up, is being asked to make a choice that has immediate personal cost and no visible benefit. The result is that the crimes continue to happen in locations where people are present, where witnesses exist, and where early intervention might be possible. But the information does not move. Drivers see things. Truck stop workers see things. The FBI has documented that this is happening. What they have not documented is a solution. The awareness exists now in a way it did not in 1975 or 1995 or even 2004. But the structure that would allow that awareness to translate into action has not been built. The gap remains open.